Well, folks, here we are again for the weekly forecast. Before we get to the main forecast, let's take a look at the last week. We've seen some very warm temperatures across much of the Central Plains, and some of that heat's now shifted toward the eastern Corn Belt. Consistently seeing highs in the upper 90s to the low 100 to 105 degree range. And of course, with pollination coming on, the concern is whether or not this will interrupt the process, and we'll see some significant yield declines resulting from this heat. And of course, the lack of moisture. That has become a very significant problem, particularly in the eastern part of the state that had seen some semblance of some rainfall off and on for the last month and a half, but nothing that would overwhelmingly take us from the dry to the wet side. And now we're starting to see the repercussions of that as the crop slowly starts to deteriorate due to the heat stress. Now, there are some good signs in terms of temperatures. We should see a briefer cooler down here for the next few days before we start to see a gradual warm up, with the potential for some on-again thunderstorms, particularly as we go through this weekend, and lesser chances we regress through the week. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we have in store as we move through this next 7-day period. And as we go to the upper air charts, the first thing I'll draw your attention to is a large expanse of high pressure system that dominates much of the Central Plains and the eastern Corn Belt is now starting to move its way toward the west in response to a trough coming over top of the ridge and flattening it out. And this will help to dig a trough in the eastern Corn Belt. Now, the models are having a little bit of time determining how deep this trough is, and the deeper it is, of course, the much cooler air will move into eastern Nebraska. If this trough doesn't dig as deep, then the conditions are not going to be nearly as cool. But certainly for today, we are looking for highs in the lower 80s across the northwest behind the cold front that has been pushing southward through Nebraska. And we'll be looking at, in the very southern part of the state, we'll be looking at highs in the lower 90s, with thunderstorm chances increasing from northwest to southeast over the next 24 hours. And by the time we get to tomorrow, we will see that the trough starts to dig into the eastern Corn Belt, and high pressure system centers itself well west of Nebraska. So we'll be looking for some cooler conditions, highs in the low to mid 80s across the east, and then across the west we'll be looking more in the mid to upper 80s, with again the chance of afternoon thunderstorms as this cold front at the surface tries to push into the Central Plains. Now, as we go into Monday, we're going to see pretty much an elimination of all the precipitation in Nebraska that remains south of us over the high plains region, but we'll still stay with the cooler temperatures. We'll be looking at highs in the low 80s across the east, and as you get into western Nebraska, we'll be looking at highs in the upper 80s to the low 90s. Now, as we go into Tuesday, we'll notice that the cool air is still in place across the east with this trough digging into the eastern Corn Belt. For the western part of the state, the ridge starts to build back into the region, so we'll be looking at highs in the mid 80s across the east to the low 90s across the west. By the time we get to Wednesday, the ridge starts to move a little bit farther eastward. We'll be seeing an increase in temperatures, upper 80s northeast to the mid 90s across the west. As we go to Thursday, it pushes a little bit farther toward the east's ridge, so we're looking at a bump up of temperatures to the low 90s across the east to the upper 90s across the west, and pretty much the same thing as we get into Friday. Same type of temperature regime. 8 to 14-day forecast indicates warmer conditions remain in place. And in terms of precipitation, unfortunately, dry conditions are also looking very promising.